All right. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us this morning. My name is Matthew Menendez with White Plume. We're going to go ahead and jump right in. So thanks again for joining us. If you have any questions as we go, feel free. You don't need to hold those to the end. Just put those in the questions panel, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right. So we're going to talk about the missing revenue cycle KPI today. But one story that I wanted to share with you as we get started is the story of Mike D'Antoni. You may not know his name, you may not know his story, but his fingerprints are all over the NBA of today. Mike D'Antoni grew up in West Virginia, played basketball through his father, who's a local high school coach, and after a successful college career at Marshall, he was drafted in the second round of the NBA draft. And he played in the NBA for 2 years, and during that time he was cut by 2 different teams and found himself at a career crossroads. At that time, he said it was probably one of the lowest points of his life. He was 26 years old and didn't know whether he should go back to school, do something in the real world, or continue playing basketball. Eventually, he decided to leave the United States and to play professional basketball in Europe, playing for a team in Milan for 13 years as a leader of the team as a point guard. He eventually became the head coach and slowly introduced this new idea of how to play a brand of fast-paced, positionless basketball. In 2004, he eventually found his way, took over the head coaching job for the Phoenix Suns, and he inherited a team that had only won 30 games the year before. But Mike D'Antoni, he understood the value of the three-pointer, and his offense took advantage of spreading the floor and quickly finding the open shooter to increase scoring. For years, basketball teams had focused on statistics like points and rebounds and steals, but D'Antoni introduced the concept of 7 seconds or less. He wanted his team to find the open shooter and shoot the ball in 7 seconds or less. And this new metric drove the success of the Suns and ultimately transformed the way that basketball is played in the NBA. The last 4 teams to win the NBA championship all played basketball the way Mike D'Antoni coached the Suns. And so what he did by introducing this new metric was completely turn the team around. In 1 year, they doubled their number of wins. They scored 21% more points per game. And he was the coach of the year, and his point guard, Steve Nash, was the MVP of the NBA. So the question for us this morning is, what does that have to do with running a successful physician practice? How does this relate to us? And there are 3 things that I want you to think about today, because that's a great question. Mike D'Antoni focused on creating a metric that could measure the process that would deliver the result that he wanted. He didn't say that points and rebounds and steals weren't important metrics, but he knew that there was a missing KPI, and so he had to create this new metric of 7 seconds or less. And that metric focused on the process, right? The process that would deliver the outcome that he wanted. And then the third thing that I think relates to us today is that this was a repeatable process. You could take this same idea, the same concept, the same metric, and move it to other teams and be successful. And this missing revenue cycle KPI that I'm going to talk about today is the exact same way. It is a metric that measures the process, that gets us where we want to go, and it's repeatable across practices. So that's where we're going to spend our time and energy and attention today. And I'm going to divide the webinar into 3 parts. Number 1, what is this new metric? Number 2, how does it work? And then number 3, try to get real practical and think about, could it work for you? Could it work for your practice? So what is the new metric? How does it work? And can it work for you? So let's first talk about that new metric. And so my team, looking at 6.5 million encounters in our data warehouse with all the different practices that we work with, we realized that revenue cycle managers, consultants, practice leaders for the last 20 years have really drilled down and done a great job of improving some of the important KPIs in the revenue cycle. Denial rate being far and away number 1. practices have continued to work hard to drive the denial rate down, and now most practices are under 5% denial rate, which is excellent. The second KPI that people focus on is charge lag. How do we shrink the time from when the patient is seen to when the claim goes out the door? How do we get that to as small as possible? And then the third thing is looking at those AR days, making sure we have a minimal amount in that 90-day plus bucket, and trying to keep everything as current as possible, turning those claims into cash. These are all excellent, excellent metrics that the industry has done a great job of improving and standardizing over the last 20 years, but they are not complete. They're not complete. They don't paint the full picture. Because one of the things that it misses is looking at the process. What does it take? How much does my practice have to invest or spend to generate these types of outcomes? Right? Think about your denial rate. If you have a 2% denial rate and somebody told you you can get it down to 1%, you'd say, great. If somebody told you it cost $1 million to get it down to 1%, you'd say, no way, it's not worth it. But most practices don't have a metric that looks at how much they have to invest or spend to create these types of outcomes. They don't have a metric that looks at how efficient and productive is my team, right? How productive are my coders? How do I benchmark coder productivity within my practice so I can compare them to one another? And how do I compare them to other similar practices? We don't have the tool for that. And it's very frustrating because a lot of people thought we were going to get those types of tools when meaningful use comes around, right? We thought meaningful use was going to really automate a lot of the revenue cycle. But what we found out is that that's really not true. A lot of people had high expectation for what meaningful use could do, but they never really materialized. When we ask practices kind of what their process, what their workflow looks like today, we find that the vast majority of practices say that their physicians are using the template in the EHR, but that coders are spending more and more time reviewing that coding data. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to us. Doctors did not go to medical school to be coders. That's not where their expertise is. That's not where their interest lies. And it's certainly not a good use of their time, right? But what happens is now we have doctors that are going through and creating all of this coding data that they don't enjoy doing. And on top of that, the coders are spending more time to make those corrections behind the physician staff. Very, very frustrating for everybody involved. And so people throw more and more coding resources at this problem. In fact, when we ask practices across the country, over 40% of practices expect to have a coding hiring need over the next 12 months. For some practices, that's churn within their employee base, but for others, they're adding net new positions. And the reason why is coders are very hard to find. They're becoming increasingly expensive, and there's currently a shortage of coders that's projected by the National Labor Board to last for the next 5 years. Right? That is really frustrating. And when practice leadership wants to be able to help, that frustration is compounded because coding process is a black box. It's really hard for managers, for leaders to see what the coders are doing. What types of changes are they making? What types of changes are they making for certain doctors? Which ones are they making most frequently? How does that compare to other coders? How do I benchmark that to other practices? And if I can't see what's happening, if I can't measure that, it's very different to manage it. It's also very difficult for me if I do have that type of turnover to make sure that I get the new coder up to the same level of productivity as the old coder in a short period of time. I've got a lot of turnover risk in my cash flow, and that's really frustrating from a leadership perspective. So the missing revenue cycle KPI that we've seen practices implement very successfully is called encounters per coder per hour. Encounters per coder per hour. And that's a productivity metric. It's a productivity metric that allows me as a leader to compare coder performance within a practice. Typically, when we have these types of conversations, we have managers, we have the revenue cycle director who says, I knew it. I knew that she was the best coder. I knew that she handled the majority of the work. But other times they're surprised. Sometimes you're surprised with the results. It's really helpful to be able to put your hands on the data. And that not only allows me to compare performance within my team, but it allows me to benchmark that to other practices. What's the national average for encounters per coder per hour? What's the national average for coding change rate? What changes are we making most frequently? And the idea behind all of this data is not to beat the coder over the head, but to be able to identify opportunities to improve performance, to be able to make the practice outcomes better, to be able to make my people better, to be able to make my process better. Let me share with you just a story of comparing two practices that look very similar to each other. One that cannot track coder productivity and one that can. All right, so if I look at these two practices, obviously the top performing practice is the one that's tracking coder productivity. They're very, very similar. They both have 30 providers. They both see about 900 patients per day. And they both have done a great job of working that denial rate down. 2% denial rate, very, very good. They've also done a good job of making sure they're getting the data in a timely manner from the clinical team. Data coming out of their EHR, signing notes on time, 2-day charge lag, very good job by those clinical and coding teams. Now the average practice can handle 30 encounters per coder per hour. Right? 30 encounters per coder per hour, which is a little bit above the national average. But that top performing practice has leveraged the data in order to get their coder productivity up to 135 encounters per coder per hour. That's over 4 times more productive than the average practice. And as a result, the average practice spends nearly 3 times the amount of time on that coding review process. And what that means for the organization, what that means for the practice, is that they're not as efficient as they could be. And by tracking this new KPI and managing this new KPI, they can drive over $200,000 of annual operating income for the practice. Right? Think about a group that has a 10% operating margin. To generate the same amount of cash flow, you would have to have $2 million of medical revenue to be able to make this same type of impact. This is where practice leaders, this is where revenue cycle leaders can make a huge change for their practice. And it also helps improve their employee performance and employee engagement on their coding team. This KPI is very, very powerful. And so when we think about this, and I think about encounters per coder per hour, that's the new metric. Well, how do I actually measure that? How do I actually put that into place? The first thing that you want to do is raise some awareness of the KPI. Know that it exists. And then you want to figure out, where are you today? What's my baseline? What is my team doing today? Are we at 30? Are we at 90? Am I at 200? What is the baseline and what's the potential? Where could I be if we were to put some time and energy and attention on this? What's my baseline and what's my potential? That's always where we recommend people starting. Because once you know your baseline and once you know your potential, then we can start working on, how do I reach that potential? How do we make that type of improvement? And there's no silver bullet for that. It's any type of improvement like this is always a combination of people and process and technology. Right? So when we start to think about how do I do this? How do I measure this? is a combination of people and process and technology. Now, I'm going to talk quickly about technology and quickly about people. We'll spend the majority of our time today on process. Just I think that's the most helpful place for us to invest our time today. But from a technology perspective, when we work on projects like this with other clients, always looking for technology tools that work with your existing EHR and PM systems. You've made strategic investments in those systems, and you want to work alongside those to make them better. The technology needs to support the users, make it easy for them to do their work, and also support the process, right? Give you the types of data and analytics that you need to be able to do that process very, very well, right? But where I want to spend the majority of our time is thinking about the coding process. And this is where our team really invests a lot of our time with our clients, talking through this process, understanding what it looks like, and making recommendations like exception-only coding and rules hygiene and coding automation and workload rebalancing. That's the type of process that we're going through to try to improve encounters per coder per hour. So let me give you just a couple of examples of kind of what work we've done with clients recently. This is a large multi-specialty practice. I've removed some of any identifying information just to protect their privacy. But this is a large multi-specialty practice that uses a leading EHR and PM platform for their process. And so what we're looking at when we look at this data is trying to sort their encounters into buckets. So charge data comes in from their EHR, and we're asking, what does that encounter data look like? Well, the first bucket is what you see on the far left. It's that 49%. And those are clean encounters. That's good news. What that means is the encounter data, the charge data that came in from the EHR, that came straight from the clinical team, was clean. It was coded correctly. There were no problems with it. There were no changes that needed to be made, right? And that's a little bit lower than the national average. Just to give you some context and some perspective, the national average is that 48% of encounters are clean when they come in. So right on the average, a little bit above, but right at it for this particular group. That next section, that light blue, 14%, those are encounters where our technology tool for this particular practice made coding corrections automatically. It automatically made coding changes. You always have to be careful with that. It needs to be an always type scenario. But for this group, that's also really good news. Their coders don't need to spend their time working on those 49% or that light blue 14%. Great news. Okay, let's move to the next bucket because this is where we really want coders to be spending their time, their energy, right? This is where they're being most productive for the practices in that gray area, right? Because coding's not black and white. It's part art, part science. And that 19% are the encounters that were identified that need the coder's attention. That need the coder's attention so that they can make changes. They can add modifiers. They can relink diagnoses in the right order. That they can handle any sort of bundling problem or payer-specific guideline. That's what's happening in that gray 19%. Okay? Now, sometimes there may be edits that fire unnecessarily. That's that tiny little peach sliver that you see there. But I really want to spend my time on the far right. Because for this practice, and maybe yours too, this was the big problem for them and the big area of opportunity for them. This burnt orange 15% is what we call changes without edits. Changes without edits. And what that means that the coder found a problem that needed to be corrected. The software didn't identify it for them. And coders are very good at that. The problem is sometimes they're too good at that. They may be too good at that. And the issue with being too good at that is it means that this coding team, to find that 15%, they're looking through all of the other encounters, right? They're looking through everything, trying to find that 15%. And that's not what this team wants to do. They want to spend their time fixing problems, not finding problems. Right? And the right process for that is to be able to build the edits to catch those. So we move that burnt orange into the gray section. But that's a hard thing to do. It requires a cultural change. It requires a behavior change for the coders, right? It's a process problem, not a technology problem. And so with this particular client, we drilled down to be able to look at what those buckets look like for individual coders, for individual users of the application, so that we can get the details that says what's happening, where are we spending this time, how do we make that better? Because here's the big win for this group. The big win for this group is 63% of the encounters do not need their coders' time. We only want them spending their time on this 34%. And how do we leverage the technology to do that? Because if we can do that, it will at least, at the very minimum, make them 3 times more productive than they are today. But without the data, without the analytics, without the right tools, I have no chance of being able to make that type of improvement. Right? It's a combination of people and process and technology. And the ability to get to exception-only coding is the number one driver of encounter per coder per hour. That's the number one thing you can do if you want to start to measure and manage and improve that KPI. So I talked a lot about the process. I talked a little bit about the technology. But I want you to think about your people for a second. Because if you're a practice leader who's either directly or indirectly managing coders, this will impact your people. And so I want you to think about how this type of process can make your best people even better. What if we can make your best people even better? How can we focus their expertise at the exact point where it's needed? I want you to think about 2 coders working on the same team, Alice and Barbara, and they both have 100 encounters that they need to work. They both have the national average 48% change rate, and 15% of those changes can be automated. Right? So what we really want to do is focus their time on those gray areas, the parts that require their decision making, the parts that require their coding expertise. Now, Barbara, she's a little old school, and she's still reviewing every single one of those encounters, trying to find those mistakes. She's hunting for the problems, and she can handle 30 encounters per hour. So it takes her, 3 hours and 20 minutes to handle those 100 encounters. That's how she spends her time. But Alice has leveraged the data. Alice has leveraged the tool. Alice only touches those encounters that need her attention. And what that means is she can do 90 encounters per hour. She's 3 times faster than Barbara. She spends her time deploying her expertise. She spends her time correcting problems instead of looking for them. And that improves employee engagement. That makes your best people more productive. It makes them less likely to leave. Right? But it is a change for them. It is a change for their thought process. It is a change for their culture. And so to do this successfully, there are some people changes. We have to redefine what success looks like. We have to redefine what some of those key performance indicators for those types of positions are. And we have to give the managers of those teams and those people the tools and the data necessary to help. We have to give them the tools and the data to where they can help Alice, to where they can help Barbara, to where they can drive the type of return for their practice. Because these are big changes for the practice, and we're talking about driving $200,000 of operating income, right? It's like hiring another surgeon to generate that type of cash flow. And that's something that the back office team can do to help the front office team, can do to help the practice. So we've talked about what this new metric is, what this new KPI is, encounters per coder per hour. We've talked about how to measure that, how to make some improvements to it. The third area that I wanted to talk about this morning was, can you do it? How might you be able to do that in your practice? And the place that I would say the best place to start is to ask yourself, what is my baseline and what is my potential? Now, if you don't know, that's okay. A lot of times when we ask this polling question, a lot of people don't know. They're unaware. It's not a KPI that they've measured before. They don't know how to calculate it. But that's okay. We've got on our website just a few short questions that you can answer, and we can tell you we can return the results to you. Here's what your baseline is. Here's, based on our experience, here's what we think your potential is, so that you'll be equipped to understand what that is. But to offer some encouragement to answer the question of, can I do it? I would say for most practices, the answer is absolutely yes. I'll share some more data with you. The industry average of looking at encounters per coder per hour, the industry average is 25 to 30 encounters per coder per hour. We've looked at hundreds of practices, and yes, there are differences between certain specialties or what your case mix looks like, but looking at all across the board, looking at every specialty, every size, every geography, the answer across the board is 25 to 30 encounters per coder per hour. Now, the average at White Plume for our clients is 141. So that's more than 5 times more productive than the average practice. And what that tells me is, if they can do it, you could do it too. So since there are over 150 practices out there who have already done this. So that says it's possible that you could also. But you need to know what your baseline is, and you need to know what your potential is. Another example, just kind of think about, can you do it, is I've seen change in our client base where they've been able to make significant improvement. If you look at the clients that my team works with from January to December 2018, the client average increased by 57%. And there are a lot of factors that go into that. But beginning to know what your baseline is and what your potential is, and having the data to work with the White Plume team on, how do we get better? How do we identify best practices? How do we get to exception-only coding? How do we get to coding automation? How do we get to rules hygiene? By continually making that improvement on a quarter-by-quarter basis, you can improve from your benchmark to your potential. So you can do it. Other practices have made this type of improvement on a large scale, and your practice can too. I'll leave you with one more story about a practice recently that my team worked with. It's the orthopedic group down in Mobile, Alabama. And what they were doing was, before we had this 3-month project with them, their coders were reviewing every single encounter after the clinical team finished. They were doing a lot of the linking. They were making a lot of individual corrections. they were certainly not doing exception-only coding. And the coders collectively spent 36 hours per day reviewing all of those encounters. Now, there's a lot of hard work and energy and effort that went into this process to identify what changes they were making, which ones were happening most frequently, how do they build rules to identify all of those, how do they retrain their staff, and kind of relaunch this process. But after 3 months, they are now only spending 4.5 hours per day total. So they went from 36 hours to 4.5 hours every day. And that makes them 8 times more productive than they were before. That's how you can improve encounters per coder per hour. They did it. And you can do it too. And remember, that makes a big difference between the average practice and the top performing practice as far as encounters per coder per hour is concerned. It can be 3, 4, even 8 times more productive. And for a 30-doctor practice, that can drive over $200,000 of operating income a year. Now, I would recommend the best place to start, if that's something that you want to consider, is to understand what your baseline is and to understand what your potential is. I'm happy for anybody who's interested. We can send you the link for the encounters per hour calculator on our website. There's no cost to that. We're happy to provide you with that for the people that attended the webinar today. If you'll just let me know in the questions panel if that's something that you'd be interested in, I'm happy to get that information to you. Just a little bit of background information on us before we close. I'll give you just a couple of background pieces of us. We're celebrating our 20th year in business today. We're founded in 1999 by my dad, so White Plume is near and dear to my heart. We're still privately held, headquartered in Birmingham, Alabama, and we work with over 5,000 doctors across the country, mostly with large practices. We do a lot of work in multi-specialty, a lot of work in orthopedics, a lot of work in ophthalmology, but we work with over 40 different specialties. And typically where clients are asking for us to help is to help them deliver world-class coding outcomes. It's not just about the denial rate. Yes, we can help you with your denial rate, but a lot of it is about the productivity of your team. What's the new metric that you should be paying attention to drive coder productivity and leverage the investment you've already made in your EHR and PM systems? That's what we are excellent in and would love to work with you if that's something that your team is interested in improving. So I'm going to say thank you for attending today. I certainly appreciate it. I would love for your feedback. There's a short 3-question survey at the end of the webinar. That helps me make these webinars as valuable for other people going forward. So if you don't mind taking just a short amount of time to answer those questions, I sure would appreciate it. But with that being said, let me open up the questions panel and see what questions we have that are good for the rest of the audience.